In 1943, Henry Ford II was sitting in a Navy uniform when he received news that would change his life forever. His grandfather, the legendary Henry Ford, was losing his grip on the company that bore his name. The old man was 80 years old, increasingly erratic, and the family empire was bleeding money at a rate that would have destroyed any other business. But this wasn't any other business. This was Ford Motor Company, and the scandals, the betrayals, and the family warfare that brought it to this point. That's a story that involves everything from Nazi sympathies to murder accusations, bitter rivalries, to billion-dollar grudges. We're also going to look at the Chrysler family, because their story runs parallel in ways that are almost too perfect. Two dynasties, two sets of scandals, and a whole lot of wreckage along the way. So let's begin. But first, how did these families become American royalty in the first place? To understand the Ford scandals, you have to understand Henry Ford himself. And Henry Ford was, to put it mildly, a complicated man. He was born in 1863 on a farm in Dearborn, Michigan. By the time he was in his 40s, he had revolutionized American manufacturing with the Model T and the assembly line. By 1920, half of all cars in America were Fords. Half. Think about that for a second. One company, one man's vision, dominating an entire industry. But here's the thing about Henry Ford. The same obsessive focus that made him successful also made him dangerous. He was paranoid. He was controlling. And he held views that, even by the standards of his time, were considered extreme. In 1918, Ford bought a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent. Now you might think a car manufacturer buying a newspaper is just a vanity project, and maybe it started that way. But what Ford did with that paper was something else entirely. Starting in 1920, the Independent began publishing a series of articles that were viciously anti-Semitic. We're talking about 91 consecutive issues attacking Jewish people, blaming them for everything from World War I to jazz music. Ford eventually compiled these articles into a book called The International Jew, which was translated into 16 languages and became required reading in Nazi Germany. I mention this because it's impossible to understand the Ford family scandals without understanding that Henry Ford wasn't just a businessman. He was an ideologue, and his ideology poisoned everything it touched. The labor disputes came next. Ford had built his reputation on paying workers $5 a day, which was revolutionary in 1914. But by the 1930s, the company had become something closer to a police state. Ford created a department called the Service Department, headed by a former boxer and Navy veteran named Harry Bennett. And Harry Bennett was not a nice man. Bennett's job officially was security. Unofficially, he was Ford's enforcer. He hired ex-convicts, ex-boxers, anyone willing to use violence to keep the workers in line. When the United Auto Workers tried to organize Ford plants in 1937, Bennett's men attacked them. The incident, known as the Battle of the Overpass, was photographed by journalists. Images of union organizers being beaten bloody made national news. Ford's reputation never fully recovered. But the family conflicts, those were somehow worse. Henry Ford had one son, Edsel, and Edsel was everything his father was not. Where Henry was crude and combative, Edsel was refined and diplomatic. Where Henry saw cars as utilitarian machines, Edsel understood them as objects of desire. He pushed for better design, more modern engineering, everything the company needed to compete with General Motors. Henry Ford destroyed him for it. The old man undermined Edsel at every turn. He'd approve Edsel's projects, then cancel them without warning. He'd promote Harry Bennett over Edsel's objections, making it clear who really held power. He publicly humiliated his own son in front of employees. And when Edsel developed stomach cancer in 1943, some family members believed the stress his father inflicted had contributed to the illness. Edsel Ford died on May 26, 1943, at the age of 49. He never got to run the company he was born to lead. Now here's where it gets really interesting. After Edsel's death, Henry Ford, now 80 years old and showing signs of dementia, took back control of the company. The board was terrified. Ford Motor Company was a major defense contractor during World War II, and having an increasingly unstable anti-Semite running it was not exactly ideal for national security. The government actually considered taking over the company. That's how bad it was. Instead, the family intervened. Edsel's widow, Eleanor, and Henry's wife, Clara, essentially staged a coup. They convinced the Navy to release Henry Ford II, Edsel's eldest son, from military service. Then they confronted the old man. The story goes that Clara Ford told her husband that if he didn't hand over control to their grandson, she would leave him. Henry Ford capitulated. On September 21, 1945, Henry Ford II became president of Ford Motor Company at the age of 28. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, back to the story. Because Henry Ford II inherited a disaster. The company was losing $10 million a month. There was no modern accounting system. Nobody actually knew how much money Ford had or where it was going. Harry Bennett was still lurking around, plotting to maintain his power, and General Motors was eating Ford's lunch in the marketplace. Henry II cleaned house. He fired Harry Bennett within weeks. He brought in a group of young management experts known as the Whiz Kids, including a future Secretary of Defense named Robert McNamara. He modernized everything his grandfather had let decay. But Henry Ford II had his own scandals brewing. His personal life was a tabloid goldmine. He married 3 times. His affair with Italian jet-setter Christina Vittoria Austin was conducted so openly that his first wife, Anne, discovered it by reading the newspapers. His drinking was legendary, and his temper made his grandfather look restrained by comparison. The most famous incident came in 1978. Lee Iacocca was president of Ford Motor Company, the man who had created the Mustang and saved the company from irrelevance in the 1960s. He was, by most accounts, the most talented executive in the American auto industry. Henry Ford II fired him anyway. When asked why, Ford reportedly said, "Sometimes you just don't like somebody. That's it. No performance issues, no strategic disagreements, just personal animosity." Iacocca would go on to save Chrysler from bankruptcy and become one of the most famous businessmen in America. But he never forgave Henry Ford II. The grudge between them lasted until Ford's death in 1987. Now, let's talk about Chrysler. Because while the Fords were busy tearing each other apart, the Chrysler family was dealing with its own drama. Walter Chrysler was a different kind of founder than Henry Ford. He wasn't a visionary inventor. He was a mechanic who became a manager, who became an industrialist. He worked his way up through the railroad industry, then moved to Buick, then took over a failing car company called Maxwell and transformed it into Chrysler Corporation in 1925. By 1929, Chrysler was the second largest automaker in America, behind only General Motors. Walter Chrysler built the Chrysler Building in New York, at the time the tallest building in the world. He was, by any measure, a success. But Walter Chrysler died in 1940, and unlike Henry Ford, he didn't leave behind a family dynasty ready to take over. His sons, Walter Jr. and Jack, had minimal involvement in the company. The Chrysler family essentially walked away from the business their father had built. This would prove to be a different kind of scandal. Not the dramatic, tabloid-friendly variety, but the slow erosion of a family legacy. The company lurched from crisis to crisis over the following decades. In the 1970s, Chrysler was on the verge of collapse. The oil embargo, competition from Japanese imports, and a series of terrible products had brought the company to its knees. The federal government eventually provided a bailout, the first time Washington had rescued a major American corporation. And who led that rescue? Lee Iacocca. The same man Henry Ford II had fired out of personal spite. I love that detail. The automotive industry is small enough that these grudges keep intersecting, but the Chrysler family scandals weren't over. In fact, they were just getting started in a different form. The labor disputes at Chrysler were every bit as vicious as those at Ford. During the 1930s and 1940s, Chrysler plants were hotbeds of union organizing. The company fought back hard, though never with quite the same brutality as Harry Bennett's goons at Ford. Still, there were strikes, lockouts, and violent confrontations that shaped the company's relationship with its workers for generations. The real Chrysler family drama, though, was about money and legacy. When Walter Chrysler died, he left behind an estate worth millions. His widow Della controlled much of that wealth, and the fights over who got what, and who deserved what, and who had really earned their place in the family hierarchy, those fights lasted for decades. Walter Jr. tried to stay involved in the automotive world, but he never achieved anything close to his father's success. Jack Chrysler became better known for his personal life than his professional accomplishments. The family name remained on the company, but the family itself faded into the background. Meanwhile, at Ford, the family was still very much in charge and still very much fighting. Henry Ford II had a brother named William Clay Ford, who served on the board and owned the Detroit Lions football team. The brothers had a complicated relationship. Henry ran the company with an iron fist, and William stayed in his shadow, accumulating resentments that would surface after Henry's death. The next generation was even more complicated. Henry Ford II had 3 children, Charlotte, Anne, and Edsel II. None of them took over the company. Instead, when Henry II died in 1987, leadership passed to professional managers outside the family. But the family still owned a significant stake, and they still had a seat at the table. And family dynamics have a way of making business decisions personal. In 2001, William Clay Ford Jr., the great-grandson of Henry Ford, became CEO. He was the first family member to run the company since Henry II, and he inherited a company that was once again in crisis. The thing about the Ford family is that they seem to have a talent for near-death experiences. Every generation faces some existential threat, some scandal or disaster that should have destroyed them, and somehow they keep surviving. Under Bill Ford's leadership, the company avoided the bankruptcy that claimed General Motors and Chrysler during the 2008 financial crisis. Ford had mortgaged everything, the factories, the brand name, even the iconic blue oval logo, to secure a line of credit before the crash. It was a bet-the-company gamble that paid off. But the scandals kept coming. In recent years, there have been accusations of sexual harassment at Ford plants, quality control failures that led to massive recalls, and ongoing disputes about the company's environmental record. The family name provides insulation, but it also provides a target. And what about the Chrysler legacy? Chrysler Corporation no longer exists as an independent company. It merged with Daimler-Benz in 1998, was spun off in 2007, went bankrupt in 2009, merged with Fiat, and is now part of Stellantis, a multinational conglomerate. The Chrysler brand survives, but the Chrysler family connection is ancient history. The contrast is striking. The Fords stayed. They fought, they schemed, they betrayed each other, but they stayed. The Chryslers left, and their company was eventually absorbed by larger forces. Which approach was better? That depends on what you value. The Fords maintained control, but at tremendous personal cost. The Chryslers walked away, and their legacy belongs to history books rather than boardrooms. The labor disputes that defined both companies in the 20th century have evolved, but not disappeared. Today, the United Auto Workers represents employees at Ford's Detroit operations, though many manufacturing jobs have moved overseas or to non-union plants in the South. The battles between management and labor continue, just in different forms. And the family conflicts, those are eternal. The Ford family still controls a special class of stock that gives them 40% of voting power, despite owning only about 4% of the company's equity. This structure has been criticized by outside investors who argue it insulates the family from accountability. The family argues it provides stability and long-term thinking in an industry obsessed with quarterly results. Both arguments have merit. Both arguments are probably incomplete. So, what of the major players in this story? Henry Ford died on April 7, 1947, at the age of 83. The power had been stripped from him 2 years earlier, but he remained a towering figure in American industry. His legacy is complicated: the man who brought automobiles to the masses and the man who published anti-Semitic propaganda that inspired Adolf Hitler. Both things are true. Neither cancels out the other. Henry Ford II died on September 29, 1987, at the age of 70. He had transformed Ford Motor Company from a dying enterprise into a modern corporation, but he had also burned bridges with almost everyone who worked for him. His obituaries struggled to reconcile the executive who saved the company with the man who seemed to enjoy wielding power for its own sake. Lee Iacocca died on July 2, 2019, at the age of 94. He outlived the man who fired him by more than 3 decades. His memoir, published in 1984, became one of the best-selling nonfiction books in American history. In it, he settled scores with Henry Ford II in exhaustive detail. Some grudges never die. And what of the Chrysler family? Walter Chrysler's descendants faded from public view. The family name belongs to corporate history now, a brand owned by strangers, a reminder that empires built by one generation can be abandoned by the next. The Ford and Chrysler stories tell us something about American capitalism that we don't always want to hear. These weren't just businesses, they were families. And families are messy. They love and hate in equal measure. They build and destroy with the same hands. The scandals that shaped the American automotive industry weren't aberrations. They were features. The same ambition that builds empires also tears them apart. The same family bonds that provide stability also create conflict. There is no version of this story where everyone behaves well and everything works out. That's not a flaw in the narrative. That's the point. And that is the story of the Ford and Chrysler dynasties. 2 families, 2 different paths, and enough scandal to fill a library. Subscribe if you want more, and let me know in the comments what you thought. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.